No piki mai anō. The government added 1,000 more transitional housing places this week under the Aotearoa New Zealand Homelessness Action Plan, which was launched a year ago. Most of the new houses are for whānau with children and include wraparound support services for access to food, welfare and healthcare. Of the 1,000 homes, 43% are newly constructed. Housing Minister Megan Wood says delivering new build housing is a priority for this government and a key focus of the recently released Public Housing Plan 2021 to 2024. Professor Anthony Hoite says his company in the United Kingdom built a number of houses using a technology called CLT, which he says could be the future of housing for iwi. Professor Anthony Hoite is with us now. Morena, Professor Hoite, thanks for joining us.
Morena.
Talk to us about CLT. How does this work, and do we have examples of this here in Aotearoa?
So CLT stands for cross-laminated timber. It's essentially, you imagine plywood, which normally comes in 20mm thickness. So with CLT, that's like 10 times thicker. So CLT structures are not made of stud walls. They're solid timber, so you can have walls up to 100 mils thick, you can have floors up to 250 mil, as we did in the United Kingdom. And you do that is because the fabrication process is not only more accurate, because it's cut from computer, but then it arrives flat packed, and so the erection time is quicker. And that's quite important in cities where, you know, obstruction of infrastructure, etc., can cause delay in construction. There is a supply of CLT in New Zealand, but because there's only a limited number of suppliers, that means there's a monopoly on that. And our own testing has found that the construction price for CLT is still 30 to 40% cheaper abroad. So it could mean shipping in CLT would be cheaper than, ironically, using a local supplier.
And no one's doing that currently?
Well, like I said, they're doing it, but they're not doing it at a competitive rate. And herein lies the possibility with iwi-owned forests.
You've said it has real potential to help intervene in the housing crisis. How do you think this is? Well,
how it could intervene is specifically in terms of Māori housing, and we know the numbers, which are not great in terms of Māori are underrepresented in home ownership, overrepresented in public housing, rental, etc. But Māori currently own something like 6% of forests, and of that 13% exotic. So there's a potential for iwi owned and managed forests to provide for factories. And so I think there's a great potential there for iwi authorities to joint venture with, say, CLT companies to produce two things. One, a better economy, that's Māori involved, not just in the build works, but actually in the supply of the material, uplift in the economy. And secondly, output in terms of Māori housing. And also Māori housing is different in terms of intergenerational living and size, etc.
Now, this government has added more than 4,500 new build public houses and over 2,000 or 2,100 transitional houses so far, and it says it's on track to deliver over 18,000 altogether by 2024. Do you know what types of builds these are, and are they the right ones for Māori needs?
Well, welcome to the housing game. It's full of numbers and stats, and you can sort of lose yourself in it. So of these 1,000 homes, so 43% are newly constructed. So first of all, I expect that method of construction is the classic timber frame stud. But new builds are important because they not only grow the housing stock, but they also support the economy with jobs. And of those housing places, 60% are for families and children, with the remaining, I think, 40% for singles and couples. I think the interesting thing here is what is the potential for Māori housing. And as I said before, the Māori home ownership rate is something like 28% versus 57% for the population. So that's why I believe that the CLT, and particularly in relationship to iwi-owned managed forests, holds a lot of potential. At the moment, Māori are 5 times more likely to be homeless than Pākehā.
What about prefabrication off-site for Māori? What are some of the advantages for iwi over on-site construction?
Well, not to give another negative stat, but we Māori own 7% of the land in the country versus being 17% of the population. And foreign ownership of New Zealand land is already half of what Māori own. So the future for iwi and the future for housing is again through off-site CLT prefabrication at Māori-owned forests. So Māori have a connection to forest and forestry land through cultural and spiritual ties, and this can be monetised into a commercial sense.
And so the challenges for iwi who use off-site?
Oh, yeah. So the challenges here, well, to get from forest to factory will require funding. And so the question here will be certainly to raise that funding will lie in joint ventures. So ironically, it will probably either mean trying to find better relationships with the existing CLT supplier in New Zealand, or looking abroad and seeing if there's partnerships which can be afforded through foreign companies bringing the tech side and joint venturing with iwi in terms of who could supply forest and manpower. And in the future, the Māori ownership of forests will only grow, and could see under the treaty claims that Māori owning up to 41% of planted forests in the future. So the sustainable management of indigenous forests represents an undeveloped opportunity for Māori, and also for the forestry sector in general.
Well, help us to understand then the different types of off-site construction.
Cool. So there is one form which you might call compartmentalised. So you might you might go to Bunnings and buy some trusses, and you put up a roof. So the trusses are prefabricated. There's another type which you might call panelised, which is like CLT. Instead of just buying a truss, you might buy the entire wall now, which is flat packed, as if you're buying from IKEA. And then the third type is a sort of transportable, when the entire unit would come on the back of a truck. So that's a sort of a transportable type of prefabrication. So there's sort of three scales. One is where you just prefabricate the components. The second one, we actually can prefabricate floors and walls and total elements. And the third one is you just bring in the entire building, usually by a truck or chopper. But of course, the issue with the last option is you're limited to the size of the roads or the weight of the building, etc., etc.
Now, I've talked to a lot of really innovative businesses and those creating business ideas on this show. For those interested in considering this, is it a really expensive proposition to create these ideas to bring in? What are you looking at cost-wise?
Well, that's different. We set up a CLT factory. We're certainly talking in the millions, but I think when there's a will, there's a way. I know from our own contacts abroad that there is interest in foreign investment in projects which have a social enterprise, such as iwi own and managed forests. People are welcome to contact me if they want to have more information on that. But yes, the setting up of that kind of infrastructure is not cheap. We're not talking. We are talking in the millions. But in the meantime, I have also been working with iwi social enterprises, which have started at the smaller scale, which is basically using timber framing and to fabricate spaces up to about 30 square metres, which don't need building consent. So if you don't have any water or sanitary ware in a building, you could fabricate off-site a unit of 30 square metres, which is quite a large space, and you could then put that on the back of a truck and move that onto site. So that's quite a cheap way of doing it. So it's not the millions. This is going to Bunnings and doing it yourself.
Because I don't know if it's about that, is it? It's about setting up a proper business model and creating solutions to help iwi, to help the housing and support housing situations to put our people into, really, isn't it? Really?
Sure, absolutely. So, of course, we could do something piecemeal and rather short-sighted. And of course, when there's firefighting like homelessness, there is absolutely a need to sort of engage in that immediate step of just providing short-term but immediately housing. But of course, if we want to grow a sustainable iwi economy,
Right.
then we really got to think about the longer term aspects, and that is really, really important, because it's not only taking ownership of the economic capability, it's also taking ownership of the environment. And Māori are well placed with our connections to of the natural environment to be in this sector of forestry, factory, prefabrication.
Beautiful. Professor Anthony Hoite, thank you very much for your time this morning.
Kia ora.